All right, welcome everyone. My name is Concetta Gibson. I'm the president and co-founder of the Wild Ones Delmarva Chapter. I'm also the founder and principal garden partner at Leaf in Bed, which is a local Eastern Shore garden coaching, consulting, design, and plant sourcing business. I'll get into a little bit of who Wild Ones is in a minute, but we are here today to talk about container gardening with native plants. We are recording, so this presentation will be available on our website. All right, for those not familiar, Wild Ones is a national organization, has chapters, something like 100 plus chapters around the country. Wild Ones promotes the use of native plants and also sustainable landscaping around the country. You can find a chapter near you by going to join.wildones.org. We love if you join our chapter as well, because we do support all of Delmarva. The goal of Wild Ones is kind of connecting people and native plants for a healthy planet. We're a little bit different than native plant societies because we do focus on native plants, but more in the developed landscape areas, although we obviously have interesting connections into undisturbed lands as well. You can find the full vision, mission statement, position, and then beliefs as well on Wild Ones website, just so you can see what we're all about. But today's topic is going to be container gardening with native plants. So today we're going to talk about, yes, you can container garden with native plants. We're going to talk about unique properties of containers, choosing containers. We'll talk about placement and layout, filling, setup, and arrangement, a little bit of care and maintenance, and we're going to touch briefly on water containers because I love them and I feel like they're a little more common than they used to be. So if you plant it, they will come, and that does include containers. The critters don't care where your native plants physically are, just that you have them. So here's a couple plantings that I have at my house. On the left, we got butterfly milkweed mixed in with some coneflower, mixed in with, I think, some black-eyed Susans on the left, some violets, and I also have some herbs and such, a little mix and match. And on the right is actually a dwarf cultivar of the Eastern Columbine. And I love a dwarf cultivar of native plants for containers. Typically, when you are choosing cultivars, flower color, leaf color can change the nutritional value and ecological services of a plant. But usually the size doesn't change anything else more than the size. There's not enough actual science research to really say exactly which genes are connected, when you're changing one or the other. But typically when you select for a different size, you're getting a very similar ecological value, service value out of them. So I love a dwarf variety. I should also mention we are here at Unity Churchill Landscaping and Nursery in Churchill, Maryland, which they are wonderful. They prioritize selling native plants and really support wild ones, which is really, we really appreciate it. They also got a ton of stuff for sale, which is really nice, really good quality place. And we thank them for letting us use their space today. So why use containers instead of just planting in the ground? Right. So you may not be able to plant in the ground. You might not be allowed to. You might have some physical or medical considerations. You might just like the aesthetics of container materials. That there's so many cool containers that are out there, aesthetically. You might want to help combat habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation is what happens when you develop an area and you cut human use architecture, roads, things like that through a habitat that ends up fragmenting it and making all these barriers that the critters really have a tough time getting past, whether it's they physically can't get there from one side to the other of the habitat. Maybe there's a road and you have cars and that's dangerous for critters, right? So you can use containers to help kind of leapfrog between different parts of the habitat that have been fragmented. You might want to attract pollinators and support wildlife generally, and you like the idea of having containers. Containers are also great for containing aggressive species. Just watch for things that might escape out of a drainage hole, but it's way easier to monitor one drainage hole than it is an entire root ball in the ground. Things like the native mints can be a little aggressive, and some other not to pick on mints, but there's a decent amount of aggressive species that are native. They just will take over a space, and they're great for a container. You might want to mix and match your herbs and food garden plants with native plants. If you're looking for pollinators to come to your vegetables, to your fruits, adding some native plants is going to be great for attracting them. You may want to make temporary container arrangements, maybe for like your patio. If you've got a patio party coming up and you want something nice on the patio, you can throw a couple of native plants in sort of a temporary container. And then after that party, you can always, put them out in the garden bed. And they're also great for cut flowers and grasses, as long as you're doing that responsibly and not over harvesting, letting the critters have most of them. Got a couple pictures here on the left. We've got coneflower with my English roses, but mixed in with river oats, and then some liatris sprigs as well. So just a couple in a little mason jar can look really nice on the counter. A couple flowers that are almost spent. Seed heads as well. And then on the right, we've got one of our native roses. I put this in, it's a Virginia rose. I stuck it in a 5-gallon teal food bucket, drilled some holes in the bottom beforehand, filled it up, put it in. The critters never want my English roses. They always just want this rose. And you can see on the picture, there's blooms, there's buds. I mean, it goes nuts even just in a small container like this. It won't grow full size, and we'll talk about that, but you're still going to get a lot out of it. So some unique properties of containers that are specific to containers. If you're a garden bed or even a raised bed grower, they dry out faster. They dry out through the top soil line. They dry out through the sides if the container is porous, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes too. This means that they need more frequent water, not more water. Containers are going to need more frequent water. Typically, we're getting, an inch or two of rain a week in Maryland during the rainy season, around Delmarva as well. During the droughts, obviously, that's a little different. And with climate change, who knows what that average is going to shift to. Usually, that's a good amount for a container. Typically, with a garden bed, you're supplementing the water mostly during drought season. For the containers, you're going to probably tack on a few weeks before and after the full drought season for supplementing water. That's kind of the biggest property of containers. Containers also deplete nutrients faster. So water is going to be going through the container and then flushing some of those nutrients that aren't being used through the container and out of the drainage hole. So that's the other thing. You're not getting as much nutrient transfer, in the ground, right? The groundwater is moving from one place to the other. Things are constantly being added into the ground and incorporated, broken up by, decomposed by different critters. So in a container, there's a little bit more modifying on the nutrient side. They also have a smaller volume for root space. So in the ground, they can spread out and, they just really have to compete with each other, the plants. In a container, they're competing with the container wall size. So if you've got smaller root space, you've got some considerations for what that means for care and what the plant is going to end up doing. Roots are also not insulated by the ground, and they may need winter protection. I will say a little bit more later about this. I have had plenty of luck just kind of leaving the containers, but there are things you can do if you're concerned or about freezing in the wintertime. The foliage is fine. They want that. The roots are used to being in the ground and insulated as opposed to in a container, right? Think of like a pool versus the ocean. A pool is going to heat up and cool down and freeze quicker than the ocean is going to be. Similar, a container to a garden bed. Okay. Generally, containers are also more mobile. They are more accessible. So if you've got some physical considerations, some medical considerations, maybe you can't get all the way down and all the way up, for whatever reasons. Generally, unless the containers are so heavy, which then you can do other things to help with that. Generally, they're going to be easier to move around and easier for more folks to use than a garden bed. And you've got plenty of aesthetic options as well with containers. Thank you. So when we are choosing containers, the biggest question, the first question is the container porous or is it not porous? Something like an unglazed clay that can absorb water and evaporate, it moves through the container wall and then can evaporate out. Something that is porous like that is going to deplete your water faster. You're going to get more evaporation happening around the container, as opposed to a container that is not porous, like a clay container that's glazed on the inside and the outside, like a ceramic container, like a metal container, things like that. One of my favorites is to start with, especially if you're new to container gardening, is to get a clay container that is glazed only on the outside. Because what ends up happening is any extra water that's in the soil volume in the container is going to absorb. The plants are going to be taking it up. It's going to be evaporating out the top. It's going to be going out. The water's going to be pouring out of the drainage hole as well. But it's also going to be absorbing into the clay wall inside. But because it's glazed on the outside, it is not going to evaporate all the way through. What it'll do is release that water back into the soil medium once it's dry enough. So I really love a outside only glazed clay container to start with if you're not sure if you're a cereal overwaterer or a cereal underwaterer. It's a nice happy medium that way. Other things to consider: how heavy are your containers? If you want to move stuff around all the time, you might want to opt for a lighter material, something like a plastic or a resin. If you want something that's a little more hefty, if you really want the clay, something like that, a lot of times they're pretty thick and very heavy, especially as you get bigger than, 12, 14 inches. So something to consider that way is the weight. You may also be a little choosy on what type of materials. So sustainability, right? Concrete is not a very sustainable product for the environment. Neither is plastic, and even resin can be unsustainable. And depending on how other types of pots are produced, they can also be sustainable environmentally or not. So if you're concerned with that, you may want to just do a little bit of research into, where are your pots being made by a home potter, or are they being mass produced in a giant warehouse and shipped across the world? Price is also a consideration. I will say you get what you pay for. If you're buying cheap containers, they are not going to last as long. The UV rays from the sun being outside and water are the two things that will degrade any material. Plastic sticks around forever, but it does start to degrade pretty much immediately. It just takes really long. And that's where these microplastics, if you've heard of those, it's just it takes so long for them to fully degrade. They do start degrading pretty quickly. So the cheaper products are going to, be a smart consumer, right? Consider the price, balance out the price with how often you might have to then replace that product that is a little bit cheaper. Always opt for a drainage hole. We're going to talk about it in a couple of minutes, but native plants, they're not the kind of plants that you put in a container, put inside in the winter and outside in the summer. They are going to be outside subjected to rain, and you don't want anything that's staying outside all the time in a container to just get swampy, and because it's way harder to fix an overwater issue in a container. I've done it before, but it's difficult. And then aesthetics for choosing containers. You can choose the aesthetics just based on what containers you like. Uh, you know, Designs, colors, textures, things like that. You can get containers that complement your plant colors, textures, and shapes. You can get containers that complement each other, same colors, different colors, opposite colors, things like that. And then also considering the scenery around. We'll talk about that later in the slides as well. So if you've got a white house, do you want white containers, or do you want the containers to be a different color that are going to pop? Here's a couple examples, just some more container examples. On the right, we've got the river oats, Chasmanthium latifolium, just an 18-inch container that is tall, which is nice for native grasses. They have longer, skinnier root systems as opposed to wider ones or bushier root systems. And on the left, in the very front bottom, it's in the plant's here in a half barrel. I think it's a resin half barrel, whiskey barrel container. We've got a little sedge in the front. There's another leafy plant on the side to the right in that container. but the main focus is this jessamine, the Carolina jessamine, which is just gorgeous. The bright yellow tubular flowers. You've got the leaves that are a really dark green. They're a little bit shiny. They turn purple in the wintertime. And up against a brick building behind it with the dark blue window, like frosted window, it's just such a gorgeous combination. This is one of my clients, Craft Bakery. We love them so much in Denton, Maryland. They are wonderful. And I did their outdoor container garden because they are brick on brick on brick outside, but they wanted a little garden of some kind, something easy to maintain because they're up at, 3, 4 in the morning baking. They don't have a lot of time to go around and pick a ton of weeds. So we designed their container garden to fit their lifestyle, to fit their aesthetics. The jessamine is cool too because it will climb, but since it's a vine, it'll also like trail and be a little bit of a ground cover, and it kind of does its own thing. It's just very natural. It looks really nice in front of that building. So choosing containers, I've got a little chart here. So in the recording, you can go ahead back and take a look at this. I'm not going to go over it completely. We talked a little bit about some of these here, but this chart goes through like different materials that are out there, common materials for containers. Is it sustainable? Is it water permeable or porous? What the prices typically are, what the weights typically are, and a couple of notes as well. So feel free to take a screenshot or as you're watching the recording, go ahead back and pause so you can really, if you're interested in the different types of common container materials. And again, always opt for a drainage hole. If you are choosing native plants that you may want to eat, that you may want to use for culinary, I've got an example here. I'll show it to my camera as well. One of our native mountain mints, I picked out some of the leaves and then put them in my dehydrator. It's like a very sweet mint flavor and smell, and it's incredible. You want to make sure that if you're growing that in a container, the container is also food grade. So you don't want, I had a client ask before, can I just go to Walmart and buy a Tupperware container and throw plants in there? I would not, just because those containers are not quality controlled, stored and sold to put edible food in. If you're getting a food bucket, that's meant for food, sure, you can work with that. But you want to make sure if you're doing edibles in containers that your materials are food grade. And also for native plants, making sure that the being a smart consumer and reading the information and making sure the container is outdoor rated as well. Some of them say in the titles, as they're being sold or in the main description, indoor, outdoor, but really make sure that anything that you're buying is rated for outdoor use, because if it's not fully, then it's going to break down a lot faster and you're going to have all kinds of interesting things kind of leaching out of the containers. I'm thinking especially like wood, if you're doing a wood container with the soil directly in the wood, is that wood treated? Is it pressure treated? What was it treated with, right? So again, being smart consumers and really looking at the products that you're using. Any questions? All right. So for placement, so where are we going to be putting these containers for native plants? I mentioned already, outdoor only for native species. They are native to this area. They require the dormancies to the area they are native to. If you bring them inside, you're going to be stressing them out because they really do need that sleepy time to recharge, take a rest from growing, and that way they can live for longer and not be stressed. You can put them on patio and deck. You want to make sure that your patios and decks are rated for the weight. If you're getting a really heavy, hefty ceramic or clay container, usually a deck or a patio is going to have some sort of rating, X number of pounds per square inch. Many of them are fine. Really, it's only when you add like a water container that you're dealing with issues, but you never know. Just check, make sure your patios and decks, if it's made of wood or anything like that, can handle the kind of weight that you're looking at. You can also supplement your garden bed aesthetics. You can throw any containers into a garden bed, and it's nice. I like doing that because if you've got a nice, soft, natural space, and then you've got this very structural, architectural house and shed and whatever, The containers are a nice addition to the garden bed because visually they transition your brain from looking at the hard structural to the soft natural, and it gives it a little bit of a nice blending if you're into that. You also want to put them in places that you can get to and remember them. If they are difficult to get to, if they're far away from your water source, if you put them along the side of the house that you never walk to, right, you may not see the early signs of water stress, pests, stress, anything like that. So uh, ideally put them in places that you remember them and can see them. You also want to consider structures and other plants that are going to be potentially shading out an area. If you've got a full sun garden bed and a shed right next to it that's going to shade out some of those shorter plants in some areas, you can not plant there, or you can choose shade species for that particular part of the garden bed. You can totally use other plants and structures to strategically put in part or full shade plants in more sunny areas if that's the type of sun that that particular area of the garden bed is going to get. I like to do like a part shade ground cover in a more sunny garden bed, because what'll happen over time is that as the main focus plants will grow, you get this ground cover that kind of grows through and around. And it's going to have enough shade throughout the day, whereas like a full sun ground cover is not going to. So maybe when you first plant the bed, start with a full sun ground cover. As the other plants grow in over the years, cycle that ground cover out and put a more shady species. So use a look around and use your surroundings strategically, especially with containers, because you can just kind of plop them anywhere. If you plop it underneath of a tree, to my next point here, if you put containers underneath of a tree in a sunny garden bed, they're probably going to need to be shadier plants just because they are under the tree. If you put that container underneath of a tree, it's not going to get as much of the rain as if it was in an open area. If you put that container around the edge of the canopy, which we call the drip line, because when it rains, that's where all the water runs to, the edges of the canopy of the leaves, and then drips down, that area might actually get more water, more rain than underneath the tree or even outside of the tree if it's really flowing off. So, consider placement, consider what's happening in your environment. And also consider where the drainage hole is draining. If you've got plants in containers sitting directly on an unfinished wooden deck, now as the water runs out of the drainage hole, you're going to have water pooling directly on the wood, and that is going to cause issues with your wood later on. So I always like to use plant stands and things like that when I'm, putting containers on my deck, just in case, even if it is a finished or sealed deck, you just don't want a lot of water sitting directly on those other porous surfaces around your property. Caddies are really great. Plant stands are really great. A plant caddy is more of what you would think maybe is on casters or rolling, which is nice, especially for a big heavy ceramic or heavy clay pot. Because if you put the pot on that caddy, maybe like a nice metal caddy, a lot of them are going to have a weight rating to them too. So you add up the weight of the container, of the soil, of the water that would be sitting in the soil and the plants, and just make sure your caddy can hold all of that. It has wheels. Now you can move it around as you need it. You also want to consider the shape of the caddy versus the bottom of the container. If you've got a round bottom container and a round caddy, it's easy enough to figure out, well, what's the diameter of the bottom of this container? Usually when they're sold, a container diameter is like the top, not necessarily the bottom. So you do want to double check and measure, or just double check the description. It'll usually tell you somewhere in there what the bottom is. But if you've got like a round container on a square caddy, now you've got a little geometry to do, and just make sure that the diameter of the pot is fully sitting on the caddy so that you don't get anything tipping over, so that you don't get into any weight issues. You can also play with heights. So if you take a look at this picture in the top right corner, the tallest container is in the back, but it's not on the same height plant stand. There are actually taller plant stands in the front on shorter pots. So what you end up doing, you can look at your container height and the caddy height, the plant stand height, and the height of the plant, but that's going to be the total height that you're looking at. So if you do want your tallest stuff in the back, you do have to consider the whole height, and you can kind of play with things. In this picture, the front middle containers are actually the same size as the container in the middle to the left, but that one is so much taller because it's on a taller caddy. And I don't like center symmetry as much in a garden, because the garden plants tend to be pretty freewheeling. So if you have perfect middle symmetry, it doesn't always it might look a little bit off with the natural shape of plants. And so I usually like to off center my symmetry or my my heights. So in the corner of our deck here, the tallest stuff is in the back, but it like gently one container at a time steps down off to the left instead of in the middle. Also consider the plants will fill in over time. They will cycle in. You'll have volunteers that get into your pots. And you will have stuff that cycles out, plants that will not make it in the container, plants that have a shorter lifespan. Maybe they're stressed from being in the container, but still will grow for a couple years, right? So always be aware and be cognizant and be gracious with the plants that they will change over time. And, if you're using smaller containers and caddies with wheels, you can always move stuff around based on what is cycling in and out of your containers. So filling and setup. Now that you've chosen a container, you've got your placement sort of down. You want to fill your container with stuff, right? So my favorite thing to do with native plants is to pick a good quality container mix and then amend it with different things, sand, perlite, compost, that species is gonna want. We have a lot of native plants that hate good soil. They want poor soil. They want just almost straight sand with some nutrients in it, right? And a lot of your container mixes a lot of them are like for flowers, quote unquote, or vegetables, quote unquote, right? The balance of the three main components that go into a container mix are going to be in a lot of those specific to the plant that is listed and not to native plants. So there is a little bit of like guessing, there's a little bit of like playing around with the mixes. The three main components in a container mix, one is structure. A lot of times in a container mix, it's peat, which is not always super sustainable for reasons. Cocoa coir, which is just coconut husks ripped up into, very fine pieces. They tend to be more sustainable because they are a renewable resource as opposed to the peat, which they have to just drain bogs, natural bogs for that take, hundreds, thousands of years to recharge. But structure component is your first one. I always recommend starting with cocoa coir instead of peat. The second component is nutrients. So you want some nutrients in your mix. Usually that's like a compost. Maybe it's humus. After your container is already set up, you can make the choice of adding nutrients as you go through compost or through fertilizer, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So nutrients, structure, nutrients, and then the third is texture amendments. Texture being the grain sizes in the container mix. I would recommend, unless you are good with containers and you know about how to DIY your own container mixes, it's not difficult by any means, but it is a little bit of thinking and experience and a little of just listening to the universe and knowing, feeling out how much to add of X, Y, and Z amendments. If you're not into the science, the alchemy of that, you can use an outdoor container mix just for whatever, tomatoes, flowers, quote unquote. Amend it with some compost and then amend it with some sand. You can use perlite, which is actually a rock. It's the white popcorny things that you see in the container mix. It's basically popcorn rocks. It's not styrofoam usually if it's a good quality mix. But never underestimate a good horticultural sand. Some sand comes with concrete in the mix. So again, be a smart consumer, read through. If you're buying sand for a container, you want horticultural sand specifically. And read the ingredients and make sure there's nothing else in it. I understand that golf course sand, like the sand they use in the pits and stuff, is also good. You don't want a play sand. Something like a play sand is going to have way too much small grain sizes because it's meant to not scratch the children, right? But that's not what we want in a container. We want coarse, scratchy sand because that's going to increase the pore space and increase the drainage in your container. I'll show the picture on the next slide of my pink molly grass. I had 2 pink molly grasses and one did great and one did not do great. And we'll talk about why. But I just planted little blue stem in a container and I used outdoor container mix. Like 1 part outdoor container mix and 1 part sand. And it's doing great. It really just wants very poor soil. You can use trays to protect the surfaces underneath if you're concerned outside about too much water running on that part of your deck or something like that. If you've got a patio, you know, whatever it happens to be, if you don't want a ton of water going out of those drainage holes, you can throw trays, you know, like container on a stand with a tray underneath. You can also put the container directly into the tray during drought season. And that way, when you do get rain, it basically bottom waters itself. You do have to be very careful because you can still drown a plant if you are using the trays in that way, but that could be, it is a way to bottom water if you need and to conserve some water. Water gardens, we'll talk about specifics to those at the end of the session here, but you can see the picture at the bottom right. Basically, the thing I'll say over and over is place your water garden first and then fill later. It's less of an issue. Like you can always move a soil container around because it's not 8.5 or whatever pounds per gallon of the actual soil. It's a little more manageable. But your water gardens, you do want to place them before you fill and set up anything. You want to consider horizontal and vertical spacing. We're going to get into those in a minute here. When you're filling them, you want to consider some of those considerations. And then the container material itself is going to significantly affect the care needs. What you fill them with is also going to affect the care needs. So if you've got a well-draining mix with lots of sand in a porous container, you have now committed yourself to more frequent watering. And like, that's okay. You just have to know that and be aware of that. If you're the kind of person that doesn't go on vacation a lot and you love to take care of your plants, that's great. You're going to be out there every day watering anyway. If you are not, you do want to be just cognizant of, again, not only what you're filling with, but also the container itself. All right, let me check our chat. I see Kathleen mentions what proportions of each would you use? If you're doing the outdoor container mix with compost and sand, let's say, for any plants that say poor soil, quote unquote, I would do like a 1 part, maybe 2 part outdoor container mix, and then a 1 to 2 part sand, like a 50-50 split. If you have a plant that wants rich soil, loamy soil, then you may not need any sand because the container mix is going to have some perlite in there, right? If you're doing a bog plant that's native, you're going to be using a different mix, a specific mix that you probably don't need to amend too much because those are very specific. So it really depends on what your plants want. So know what plant you have, number 1, what species it is, and then do a little bit of quick research of what kind of soil it needs. I'm a big fan. North Carolina University Extension, North Carolina, they have a great website. And because they have a similar climate, they're a little bit warmer, a little bit, but actually they're in most of North Carolina has a very similar climate to what we have on Delmarva. And so I like to use their website, their extensions website. They have a great plant profile website with tons of detail. So you can always go to something like that. I think the Missouri Botanical Garden has a good site as well, although they are more inland. So you don't get as much of the coastal plain. You have to like adjust for, well, if it does well in Missouri at these temperatures, minus 10 degrees off of that, you know, you have to do a little bit of math to that. But just look up what your plants actually want and then make some decisions of how you want to fill it. And honestly, if your plant's not doing well, just dump the container and like mix in some more sand or mix in some more container mix, you know. Okay, so here's the promised mully grasses. I bought them. They were plugs, I believe, or quartz, maybe quartz. Same size, same quality in the spring. I put one in a nice container with a nice mix, really rich mix. And then I put the other one just in the ground, which at my house is sand until you hit 7 inches down. And the one in the ground did the best. This is them 4 months later, whatever, in the fall. The one in the container is floppy and still didn't fully grow out well and didn't flower and just was really unhappy. And the one in the poorest soil flowered and did great. So just another example of making sure your soil mixes are appropriate. I feel like a lot of times with any container gardening, indoor plants, house plants, even like the biggest issue that people don't really know a ton about is how important the soil mix actually is. You could be doing everything right, but if your soil mix is wrong, it's going to look like a watering issue. It's going to look like a sun issue. Here's a couple pictures. One on the left is the plant caddy that I really like. It's a nice metal caddy. It's got nice hefty casters. I think it can fit up to 350 pounds of weight on top is what it's rated for. The wheels have locks on them. They swivel. And the caddy itself has not just like some holes, but has a lot of holes so that you can align your drainage hole or holes to drain through the caddy and not just get blocked up by the caddy. Well, something like that is really great for a larger container, anything ceramic, clay, anything more than maybe 16 inches diameter at the top. Anything smaller than that, even if it is clay and ceramic, you can probably get away depending on your hand and arm strength with, you know, just a regular plant stand or maybe something wooden bamboo. The larger caddies that can hold a ton of weight that are made of bamboo, after a few years, they're getting watered and rained on all the time. They will fall apart. It's just, you know, the nature of things. Bamboo is also a much more sustainable material than metal construction. So weigh the pros and cons and what you care about when you're choosing your products. On the right is one of my favorite things in the world. It is, I think they sell them as clay spikes is what they call them. Inside of there is like a soda bottle or something. Basically, what's gotten really popular the past few years has been something called an Oya, OLLAS, which is based on a native indigenous practice of putting a clay reservoir, burying that in the ground, filling that with water, letting the water from inside slowly make its way, absorb into the clay, through the clay, and into the soil. They are much more effective at watering, I think, than something like a glass bulb. You know, the pretty, they're shaped like bulbs, they're shaped like hummingbirds or whatever. You know, they're on a long stick, basically, with a hole in it. You fill that with water, put it in the soil. What that does is put water into one part of the soil. When you use something that's clay, like an Oya or like this clay spike, you get taller, like the water's coming out through the entire product there from top to bottom, which means that you get more even watering throughout the soil column in a container. Um, and it means that instead of just relying on gravity and how moist your soil is, like for the glass ones, the clay ones, it just will not come out of the clay no matter how much gravity. The water is not going to absorb through the clay into your soil medium if the soil is wet, which is nice. It does a really good job of moderating soil movement. Oyas are typically like more bulb shaped. In a container, that takes up a lot of real estate in your soil. So the clay spikes are really good for containers. I'm usually putting one clay spike. You fill the water, or I'm sorry, you fill the wine bottle, the soda bottle, anything glass with water, stick it upside down into that clay spike. You have already buried the clay spike into your soil medium, so you just refill that bottle, tip it over into the clay spike every time. You can put one clay spike in each container up until maybe 18-inch container. Then you might want to have two clay spikes, just one on each side to get the appropriate amount of water and spacing. All right. Oops. That's fine. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about spacing and setup. The horizontal spacing you want to consider first, because a lot of those, that's listed on the tag. You have every plant tag, every plant has a recommended um, width of how wide it gets, usually a range, 1 to 3 feet wide, something like that. That takes into consideration a spread, the width above ground and usually below ground for the roots. There's also a spacing number of how wide you should space them. Those spacing numbers are based on typical average agricultural practice and not necessarily native plant practice. There are plenty of native plant designers that plant everything at 6-inch spacing because not every plant's going to make it anyway. They're all going to work together, reseed, rise on themselves, move around. And so 6-inch, 12-inch spacing for everything, every like perennial, flowering perennial is a way to do garden design, right? In a container, you want to be a little bit more judicious because you only have a certain amount of space. So the spread, like if the plant is 1 to 3 feet wide, but it definitely spreads 3 feet, that includes the foliage and the roots as well. You want to consider growth habits, something like we talked about quickly earlier. The native grasses tend to have like thinner root balls, and then they go very deep. They'll go as deep as you let them grow. So a container that is taller than it is wider is actually really great for something like an ornamental grass. A lot of your flowers, your bushy flowers, the root balls are about the same width and depth, they're about the same above ground as below ground. Something like a shrub or a tree, even like a fig tree, even not that they're native here, but something like a shrub or a tree, their roots are going to go out to the edge of their canopies plus a little more because they are trying to balance and not fall over all the time. Their roots are also not going to go very deep. So if you have a native shrub, a native tree in a container, you might want to choose a container that's actually like shorter, but it's wider. Whiskey barrel plus, something that's super wide. Otherwise, you get the roots, they'll still grow down, but they won't be happy about it. And they may also end up tipping over, shifting in the container. So when you're thinking about your horizontal spacing, consider the root balls, the shapes, the sizes. Generally speaking, in a container, you can estimate how much space it's going to need by half to 1 times the spacing listed. So if your spacing is 1 to 3 feet, start with the minimum number, so 1 foot. Half of that 6 inches, that's the minimum amount of space that you probably want to give it in a container for it to grow, just survive. So that range would end up being something like 6 inches to like 1.5 feet. Might get you close to maximum size for that plant, because when you have less roots, you have less overall plant size. Some plants are still going to try to grow and not be happy about it. You can see the fig here up to the right. I had it in a container, one of those food containers. At the top, it's happy. And then as soon as it grew more leaves, this is like a month later, I think these pictures were taken. It just got sad overall. It got very upset. Turning colors, all of the stress signals tend to be a good indication that maybe it's a pot size issue if you're getting every single stress signal at the same time. So some plants will still not like it, but you can estimate how much space they'll need in that container by using that spacing that's listed, if that makes sense. Vertical spacing, you want to consider the location of where you're putting your pots and architectural features, walls, windows, things like that. Do you want to cover your windows for full privacy, or do you want to not have your windows completely open? My favorite way is actually, do you just want to see the tops of the flower stalks? We call this picture cat TV. um, so the bottom of the window in this house is about 4.5 feet off the ground. It's raised up, off the ground a little bit. We have a little bench there for the cats to sit on. So the bottom of the window is 4.5 feet tall. The plants get 4 to 5 feet tall that we like to put there, maybe 5.5 feet tall. That means the tops of them are going to grow. It's not going to block the window. We're still going to be able to see it. And then the cats can watch all the critters using all of the flowers and such. You also want to consider the facade shapes and colors. If you have a house that is symmetrical, maybe a point directly in the middle of your house that goes down on each side to wings or something like that, you have a couple choices. You can build out your garden so that the tallest plants are in the same place in front of the tallest part of your house. So you can follow the facade directly with your plant heights. Or, like I said, I'm not a fan of direct symmetry. Maybe your tallest plants are centered on each wing on the side. So when you go to the side of your house, all the way left, all the way right, shortest plants are there. If you've got wings on each side, maybe the center of each of those wings, the first third and the last third, maybe your almost tallest or tallest plants are there. And then you've got medium plants in the middle. Because what that does is it works together with your facade. It complements your facade and adds more dimensions to your facade instead of following it directly. You could also just go completely across and have plants of all the same height directly across. What that will do is highlight your house, and your plants visually become more of a background because your brain just sees, oh, that's the same. That's now a baseline. That's now neutral. So you can use your vertical spacing in ways that you can highlight one thing, bring out another thing, and the same with colors. If you've got a white house and you choose white containers, the white containers are now going to be part of that baseline neutral, and your plants are really going to pop out. If you've got a blue house and you choose white containers, or you use containers with lots of designs, the blue tends to be more of a neutral with these kind of bluish gray houses. That means your containers are going to pop. And you can use flowers that have similar colors, different colors, right? So if you're matching colors and textures, that tends to background them and keep them at the baseline and highlight other things. So keep that in mind as you're choosing colors and shapes, especially for heights. We talked about this earlier. At plants and furniture outside, if you've got a patio umbrella that might shade out some of your plants, and if you leave your patio umbrella up a lot, then just put some part shade plants behind it on the area of the garden there, on your deck. So using things strategically. Some plants have foliage that stays low, and the flowers have long stems that pop up. And that's interesting visually because if you've got tall plants behind that kind of a plant, the tall flower stems in the front visually become a part of the back row, if that makes sense. And so you can do a lot of interesting things with color matching, color complementing to bring out or background based on heights like that with the different forms of plants. We talked about stands and risers already. They help with drainage, they protect the ground, and you can design your verticals based on that. If you want a central focus point, then just choose a taller riser and throw it on there, You also want to consider your sight lines. So where are you viewing your garden from? From your eyes to the location. If you've got small stuff, shorter stuff behind other things in that sight line, now you're not getting that full view. You're getting the ecological services, but you're not getting the view. And so that's when you have to choose do I want to look at that? Do I not want to look at that? Do I just want to fill in the back? Do I want to focus on this or that? So think of your sight lines as well. I usually categorize home plants because you're typically not seeing them from too far away. Even curb appeal, you're looking at it pretty close. I usually sort plants into shorts, mediums, and talls. Shorts being up to like 1.5 feet, mediums being something like 1 foot to 3 feet. And then anything 3 feet or taller feels tall in a home landscape. So if I'm looking at like talls in the back, mediums on the side, shorts in the middle, then that's how I'm sort of thinking about them, categorizing them. And then your personal style, obviously that's the fun part. Colors, shapes, textures, and timing when things are different colors, shapes, and textures. You want to know, it's when you're thinking about blooms, like when is your bloom happening? If you've got a list of plants and there's a ton of blue plants, blue flowers, but they all bloom at different times, it might feel like a lot of blue, but it's not going to be a lot of blue throughout the season, right? So think about all of those things. Plants that have different shapes, our native roses tend to be more open, whereas like the English roses tend to have lots of petals all squished in together. We've got a lot of tubular flowers, which are really great for hummingbirds, for anything that's got a long tongue. There's moths, there's butterflies, there's bees, right? So it's good to have a variety visually anyway, usually, but also open flowers are going to be for bigger bees like carpenter bees and bumblebees, whereas the tubular flowers are going to support some of the other native bees, right? So picking a variety of shapes as well, and textures too, is really going to support ecological services as well as the visual. Do your blooms, are they fuzzy? Are they velvety? Do they look more shiny? Are they, do they shine in the moonlight or something? So colors, shapes, textures, and timing of leaves as well. So leaves, if they're not evergreen, some plants will kill off the foliage at the end of the season. And they won't grow back until a certain time. So know when your foliage too, depending on the species that you're looking at, know when your foliage is going to come up too, as well as when the blooms are going to come up. And you can usually find that information. Usually it takes, I don't know, for a lot of our native plants, something like 2 months. Once the leaves start to come up and show, it's about 2 months, maybe 3 months until the blooms start, something like that. So you can kind of estimate if you're not sure. Anything that blooms in the fall, normally that's not the first foliage to come up in the season. So considering the spacing, you also want to consider that negative spacing too. So where there is not going to be stuff. And you can kind of adjust your plants where you don't have giant gaping holes in places. You can kind of move things around to keep that negative space appropriate as well and aesthetic. And then for the containers themselves, right? So colors, shapes, textures, timing, not as much, obviously. Maybe the containers I'm looking at a bunch of containers right here in front of me. Maybe they're shiny, maybe they're matte. Maybe if they're shiny, they're probably glazed, right? If they're matte, they're probably unglazed. If you want your containers to be background, match the color to your house, or make them all some sort of neutral color and all the same color or shade of color. I showed earlier on the slides, a lot of my containers at home are like a cream color with a brown top, which meshes into the soil. So it looks like the brown fades into a cream, which fades into our white house. That's 3 colors right there, but they're all neutral and they all fade in a certain way to make them backgrounded. If you want your containers to pop because you've got cool containers, then by all means do that. You just don't want to visually, if you add a lot of flowering plants, ferns, things like that, if you add a lot of textures, colors, and shapes into the plants themselves, that might be a lot to look at with also the wild containers, right? If you like wild containers, choose like the same color flower, like all white flowers or all like shades of blue or purple or something. You can still have color and still have different textures. You just want to choose where you want to go nuts, right? Choose the thing that you want to really get fun with. Okay, so in a single 18 to 20 inch container, that's the width of the top diameter. Usually you can fit one medium, so that 1 to 3 feet wide plant. You can fit like one medium and two shorts in there, plus a clay spike. If you're feeling fancy about it, you can grab a water tray or like a shallow bowl, and now you've got a water source that's easy to clean and easy to keep disinfected. And that's 3 plants right there that you in one like whatever 2 foot space or something. You've got a nice aesthetic. Maybe you have a yellow short flower, a white medium flower, and a blue taller flower that blooms at a different time than the short one, right? Now you've got color, you've got bloom timing that's changed around, you've got ecosystem services. Is it going to save the earth by itself? No. But if you have a few of these, if everybody had one of these, that is a ton of ecological services and aesthetics that we're adding back into the landscape. The demo that I have here has a violet, common blue violet, which has a purple flower that blooms in March and April, and a pachyra, so golden ragwort, which blooms yellow, short foliage. The flower stalk shoots up to about 2 feet. Which is about a foot above the violet, and then Jacob's ladder, which gets 1 to 3 feet tall, which puts it slightly higher, a foot or so higher than the golden ragwort. And now, we've got a nice visual container. I'm thinking of my sight line. When I look at it, I want the Jacob's ladder, tallest one, in the furthest away from where I'm standing when I'm viewing this container. Make sense? Next. Oops. What? Oops. Sorry about that. Okay. Here's an example of a tray. You can put the tray underneath of the plant stand. You could use this tray next to it as the water source, right? And we've got a little foam flower, which is a great foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia, which is a great container plant. Short foliage, has some veining, some color, other color besides green, because green is a color. It's got some other colors in the foliage, and then the flower shoots up and it looks like one of those bottle brushes, right? So you've got cool textures, you've got cool colors, you've got cool shapes. And it's small, so it fits right in the container. All right, if you have like a 2 by 3 foot area, you can use the similar arrangement as like that single container where you've got 3 plants, 3 plant groupings basically. So 2 medium containers, 15 to 16 inches wide. You can fit 1 medium plant, 1 to 3 feet tall. That it should pretty much max out in a container like that. Or 2 short plants in both of those, maybe 2 plants with smaller root balls. And then 1 short plant in a 10 to 12 inch pot in the front, water tray, and now you've got a slightly more complete little habitat for critters with, something like 3 to 5 different plants. And then in a 3 by 5 foot area, which is like, the second smallest stoop in the world, you can put 5 different different containers, right? So a 17 to 18 inch container, which is that first image we saw, with 1 medium plant to completely fill it out. And then medium plant sort of in the front left, and then 2 short pots. Maybe you want your herb there on your patio, and then the rest of it's all native plants, and you've got your water tray in your bowl. So in like a little stoop area, very small patio, you can fit, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, something like 5 to 8 plants in containers with a water tray bowl. And you've got a slightly even more complete habitat. More pictures of just the height, so you can take a look at the stands, so to the left it's the same size container as the short one on the ground, but because of the plant stand height, we're getting more like visual flow between the back and the front. It's off-centered, right? It starts higher on the left and sort of drifts down towards the left, and then drifts down even more towards the right. I every year I'm rearranging my plants because things come back differently, you know, and so you can rearrange based on what the plants are doing, especially because they're native plants. And on the right, I love a cardinal flower. They can get, you know, 2 to 5 feet tall, but they stay 8 to 12 inches wide. Perfect for a tall, deep container. I think the one I have it in is like a 16-inch container, and these things get, you know, 3, 4 feet tall on my patio, and there's only like 2 or 3 in that container. But again, to the point of, yes, the height, but also the root ball shape is going to be important to deciding, can I fit a 5-foot tall plant in this container? Well, how wide is it? Repotting, we're getting into care a little bit now. Every 1 to 4 years, usually, the soil mix pores between the grains are going to compact over time. So usually, like on average, every 3 years, you can just use the same container, dump it out, change the soil out. I wouldn't try to rehab after 3, 4 years. The soil is just not worth it. It's not structurally sound anymore. You know, things, even the coco coir and peat breaks down. You can put stuff in plants in another pot. You can put them in the ground. You can take them out of the ground and put them in your pots, right? It just, you can really play around with your containers each year. More pictures. We've got the tall, skinny stalks. This is, I think, my understanding of this plant. It's a liatris, I believe. This is one plant. It just has a bunch of different stalks, and at the bottom it kind of fills things out and drapes over the container, which is a really nice look on my patio. Care and maintenance, same process as you would any other native plants. You can clear diseased leaves as they drop. You can leave any undiseased foliage. Water only to supplement what they get from nature. You can hand water, you can do clay spikes and oyas, you can do trays, you can actually do irrigation where you do the tubing. There are places that will install it for you, and there's DIY places that just give you a kit with X number of feet, linear feet in tubing. You lay the tubes, you connect it to your water source, you lay the tubes throughout your containers, and then poke the holes where your containers are. And now you've got DIY irrigation. It's really great. But again, watering only to supplement what they get from nature, which is going to be slightly more than drought season. Then spring and fall, you would add a thin layer of compost or leaves like you would any other native plant beds. But you may want to consider, is my container a 1-part mix and 1-part sand? Because if it is, add sand at this point too. It just helps to keep the container, the soil texture the same all the way through. And then you can always do a little very thin layer of hardwood mulch on top of the containers. Not a lot, not like a continuous layer. I literally just take handfuls and sprinkle them in just to help with water retention and evaporation from the top of the soil. We talked about this a little bit earlier. In the winter time, again, the same thing. You can leave the leaves, you can leave the stems, you can drop the stems at some point to insulate the roots, whatever. The roots are really the biggest thing. So I've had luck with just leaving my natives in containers. No issues, honestly. The only plants I've lost in recent years have been when we had a 6-month drought and I just didn't water as much because I was not going to waste the water for the one plant that really could have used it in the container. That was my choice to put that plant in, and so this is what happens. But what you can do is place your containers, if you're concerned about the roots, not the foliage, the top is fine. The container itself, if you're concerned that might freeze over the wintertime and kill your roots, you can wrap the containers in burlap and row covers, blankets, anything like that. Just kind of gently tuck them in for the wintertime. You can put them against the south side of your house. So it's insulated by the house, and the south side is going to give you the most amount of sun so that it heats the container up every day, even though it's cold outside. You can also, I wouldn't recommend burying containers just because you're disturbing the soil underneath of it, but you can kind of nestle them into the ground a little and then just mulch up. So buy mulch and create like a mulch volcano on just the container itself. You can store in an unheated garage or shed, but you still want it to get sun because my understanding is the solar radiation on the soil line is important during the winter, even though they're not growing. I wouldn't wrap it like a fig tree or anything like that. And again, the beginning of spring, same thing as you would do. You leave the old stems. I usually just wait until the foliage, new foliage starts to come up and is pretty well established. And that's when I pull down old stems. That just, to my mind, I know that the critters have all grown and hatched and escaped and are all safe. You know, I don't mind that look. Like brown is also a color, you know. The only thing is if you did wrap, if you did mulch, be careful unwrapping and unmulching because critters probably found their way in there because it was nice and cozy. So I just take the corner of the blanket, pull it flat, and then run away and let everything escape, you know, for like a day or something before I completely, you know, fold the blanket, wash it, put it away. And then quickly with water gardens. So on the left is one of our native ferns, the maidenhair fern. I love them so much. They're new leaves. The fiddleheads are pink and they're gorgeous. On the right, I've got an iris with the broadleaf there. In the very back is a lizard tail. On the left is a little volunteer, I think it's a rush that came in with the water lily, which is also native in that picture at least. For water gardens, you want to get water garden planting media. You don't necessarily want the really light and fluffy potting mixes because they can rot and they will just float away. You also choose felt pots or woven pots. I have never had luck with any mesh pots, even when I double them up. You put it in the water and it just all the soil starts to wash into your water and now you have to like dump and refill and it's a pain. So do a woven pot, do a felt pot. If you look at my camera, hopefully I can make this make sense into the camera. But you can get these little pots that will float in the water column, or you can prop them up on pavers inside of the water garden. Put the caddy down, put the container down, play around with plant placement. Know that be perfect, figure out what your perfect setup is, and the water goes in last. 8 and a 0.34 whatever pounds per gallon. It gets heavy very quickly. A 22-inch container that's wider than it is tall can still be like 15 gallons of water. It's a lot. And it's heavy and it will splash your knees and down. Ask me how I know. Consider your surroundings. If you've got shade plants, that's great for your water container. If you've got sun plants, that's also great. But I would recommend putting your water garden in full sun, putting a full sun tall plant in the container, and then putting any shade plants in the shade of that plant. Because if you put any water containers in the underneath of a tree, you're going to be constantly getting rid of leaf litter. And there's nothing in your water container to break that down effectively like there is in a pond. So it's just going to get mucky and gross. You want plants to cover at least 75% of the surface to prevent algae. Honestly, 90% or 100% is ideal because algae it's an old plant, or it's not a plant, it's an old organism, and they will grow wherever. Consider the diameter of the pots versus the foliage. So again, the root balls versus the foliage. The lizard tail doesn't have a really large root ball. It's a larger plant. So that's great because it'll fit in a water garden container and still look really impressive in there. And again, everything should be in place before you fill with water. Maintaining it, you want to just keep up with filling because it will evaporate out. We're very humid here on Delmarva, but it will still evaporate. So you might still have to add water to keep up with it. You want to keep up with debris removal, even just like once a day as you walk by it, just grab any of the leaves out. You can get like an aquarium little net that you can use for fish in your aquarium. Just use that for a small container. I'd also recommend mosquito dunks. The mosquito dunks have a bacteria that target mosquito larvae, black fly larvae, and fungus gnats, and don't affect any other critters. There's science behind that. I have it on good authority with multiple scientists and the labels that say that. Nothing wrong with throwing some mosquito dunks or mosquito bits, is what they call them. And your plants will be a safe space for small critters. I've had my water gardens. This is year 2, and we now have tree frogs that just hang out in all of my containers because they know that they can breed in our little water garden, which is really nice. For wintertime, unless you're very confident that your container can tolerate the freeze thaw situation without splitting or cracking, then you want to drain it. Let the container dry out and either store those plants in their pots next to your house, mulch them, anything like that, or in that container dry with row covers, blankets, something in there to insulate the roots a little bit. And that's it. I appreciate you all watching. Are there any other questions about native gardens in container? Kathleen says, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you for joining Wild Ones. I appreciate that. On the slide here, at the top is the QR code is Wild Ones Delmarva's link for our information, our website, our joining as members. Bottom right is my personal information, my business information, my virtual business card is that QR code. So that gets you to all my contact information as well. So feel free, reach out to me at either of these accounts. I tend to check my work account a little more frequently just because we just started Wild Ones Delmarva in August, and we don't have nearly the email traffic as my other emails, but you can always reach me at any of this information. And feel free to follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well. Thank you so much.